APIs are helping enhance the product, something that I was mentioning during an introduction as well, like, APIs are the way to build great products. So what is your thought about it?
Right. I guess, thank you, Ryan, for covering so many things. Very nice chat about Fire. Internally, actually, we've been thinking of using Fire as well because it is really good in interoperability. It's very easy for everyone to connect to, and it's sort of just a standardized model. But within Terra, we've actually came up with our own model, which I wouldn't say is better or worse, but it was sort of constructed from the deep down, because when you build an API, you have to really consider two giant aspects, which number one would be developer friendliness, and number two, it's efficiency and reliability. After all, the API, the last I in there is literally interface. It is what a developer would see. So in order to make the API good, you have to make sure that the documentation is on point. It says exactly what your API does, and all the way you provide data, the way they ask for data, all of that has to be very intuitive. You ideally, if, for example, you want information about a user, you do not want to put it in an endpoint maybe called activity. You want to put it somewhere that is obvious, that it's called user information, for example, right? So within this space that I've worked in, we've seen many developers come in, and we've heard many feedback from them for how they want to build their product. And they range from many type of use cases, right? They go from CGM. So, for example, they want to take glucose data and then help patients monitor their glucose intake. They go from workout plans, so they help them improve their cycling, swimming, running. Some even the sleep tracking, all of that. So what we did was that we broke down all the data that we can provide and slowly build it back up into our model. So that's one thing that you really have to consider when building an API, is how you interface, how you provide this interface back to the developers. Second thing would be the efficiency and reliability. I mean, this all comes down to the way you code and just what language you guys decide to go for. At the very start, it would probably be a lot easier, and internally as a team, if you guys are small, to just build a very quick API. This could be a REST API like what we've been speaking about so far, or a little bit older of a SOAP API. There's also webhooks, WebSockets, and then somewhat more trending. So GraphQL API helps you get data in batches a lot easier. This might also play into a role later down the line. But right now, I think REST API kind of dominates most of the space, especially in the healthcare system right now, right? So you've got at least in the wearable space, you've got Garmin, Fitbit, or Apple, and most of them make use of REST APIs every day. So jumping into the tech stack, when you just build an API, there's no real front end. There's no graphical place that the developer would use. That's the developer's job at that point. So you have to first consider the backend, what language you're building it in, and how you're going to structure it, what framework you're going to use, right? So, for example, there are famous REST API control frameworks like Flask, Fast API, Django for Python. There's also Spring framework for Java. There's also Node for JavaScript. Many of them are out there, and it actually makes it very easy for you to build it really quickly now. They literally revolutionize the space in the tech space, and essentially give you already example code that you can get started within minutes. Just have an API up within minutes. It's fantastic. But once you start getting past this stage, you have to think about a lot of bottlenecks, right? You have to think about what may be limiting your service in terms of speed. Something called rate limits are very often implemented by providers. For example, Fitbit does not allow you to query 150. I think it was 150 queries per hour for a user. So that kind of limits what you can do with provider data, and you have to really understand what your bottlenecks could be. It could actually easily be the service the sort of the backend that you've written, or database being slow or whatnot. All of that you'll have to take into consideration, right? And when it comes to REST APIs, like I said, you have to really care about the interface you give back to the developer. Right now, a lot of wearable APIs provide data in many different formats, right? So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but SOAP provides an XML format. Some providers actually do XML still, but that's a little bit old. There's JSON, which is fairly standard now, but then there's also something called fit files. I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard of it? But fit files are basically a byte encoded file that sort of makes it very nice and lightweight to store workouts, right? So for a running exercise outside, there could be millions of location samples, right? These are just longitude and latitude codes, and they're really enormous if you manage to store it into a JSON. So sometimes they compress it and put it into a fit file. There's also different ways of receiving data, such as through Bluetooth protocol, Antos protocol. This will have to be done by SDK and all of that. All of this you must take into consideration when you build the API. You want to take the data and provide it back, right? Like Aditya was saying, you hide all that backend and then you just provide an interface for them. You have to consider all these protocols to give back data. One other thing that you really want to consider as well is monitoring service. So when it comes to the technical side, you really want some sort of monitoring. But this, from experience, I can say is a lot more expensive than I would ever thought it to be. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are as well, but there's a company called Datadog, pretty big, but they charge an insane amount for, well, I cannot really say that, but they charge a pretty premium amount for data analytics. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's a company called Coinbase. This is all over the news before. Coinbase that was built $65 million for a year just for analytics. And if you were to really build an API, consider what you need to store and what you do not need to store. Sort of what you want to log or what you do not want to log. You do not want to be sending a sort of keeping track of wrong data that you do not need to, right? That also plays in the role of security and compliances. Like GDPR and HIPAA will not be happy if you're storing data that you do not need. That's something that really could play in your benefit. Think of cost as well. Actually, if you consider ever building an API yourself, you have to always consider the servers that you're running. How many servers you have to have. You have to pay for a database that you're storing anything in it. Maybe you need a file server like S3. Maybe you'll need a queuing system if your architecture is event-based or event-driven. And then you also have to pay engineers work to maintain and continue building this out. All of these factors in probably more than you would want to pay if you would just pay another service to do it. All of this should be taken into consideration if you want to use an API. In terms of product enhancement, though, if you use a self-infinite API, it's generally quite useful if your app requires this kind of data. For example, like I said earlier, we currently have, for example, one of our clients to do, they do sort of fitness challenges, and they keep track of how many miles the user has run, how many steps, how many workouts in general, even counting the amount of push-ups they do is sort of a challenge that they do. We provide the data back to them so they can sort of just run these challenges themselves. They do not have to care about getting these data from the providers, and this limits just to sort of just boost their app. They can spend all their money, sort of spend all their fundings and whatnot, mainly building out their core features rather than bothering with all the deep down technical problems that building this API would introduce them. But yeah, that's sort of what I want to cover, and yeah, thank you so much.